She fired me with a smirk, said I was dragging them down. 18 years of building Harper machinery from the ground up, gone with a wave of her manicured hand. But what she didn't know was that I'd prepared for this moment long ago. While she played CEO, I built systems, trained her staff, and secured a contract clause that would flip the power dynamic the second she overstepped. They thought I was finished. But when you fire the man who knows how the whole machine runs, sometimes the machine follows him. This isn't a revenge story. It's a reckoning. "We don't need old men like you dragging us down," she said, flipping her hair with the kind of arrogance you can only earn by inheriting something you didn't build. I didn't answer her, just stared for a second, long enough to make it uncomfortable, then gave her a sarcastic nod. She already had her eyes back on the tablet in front of her like I was nothing more than another spreadsheet line she was about to delete. I stood up, adjusted my jacket, and walked out of her office without a single word. No argument, no scene, no desperate final plea to keep the job I'd given nearly 2 decades of my life to. That wasn't my style. I wasn't the guy who raised his voice in meetings or waved around his title like a badge of honor. I just did the work. Quietly. Reliably. 18 years at Harper Machinery. Most of it as operations manager. 18 years of knowing where every bolt, every budget line, every moving part in that factory lived and breathed. Now I was carrying it all out in a cardboard box. The younger staff avoided my eyes as I passed. Some of them I'd hired straight out of high school, taught them how to read schematics, troubleshoot malfunctions, think on their feet. And now they just stood there, frozen in place, watching me pack up the life I'd built without saying a damn thing. Not because they didn't care, because they were scared. Vanessa made sure of that. Charles Harper had been different. He built the place from nothing, starting with a lathe in his garage and turning it into a $30 million operation. He believed in loyalty, in sweat equity. When his health began to fail, he'd pulled me into his office and said, "You're the only one I trust not to cut corners." That's how I got the job. Not with a degree from Miami or buzzwords about innovation, just years of showing up, doing the work, and giving a damn. But Charles wasn't there now. His daughter was. Fresh off a 2-year stint in Miami, full of ideas about disruption and synergy, and whatever else they teach in boardroom theory class. She didn't want people who remembered how things worked before she arrived. She wanted control, clean slate, fresh paint. I placed my box in the passenger seat of my truck and sat for a minute, hands resting on the steering wheel. Through the windshield, I could see the machines I'd maintained, the systems I'd designed, the people I'd mentored, all still humming, for now. But that hum wouldn't last. What Vanessa didn't know, what she hadn't even bothered to check, was that my contract had a clause in it, one Charles insisted on, 2 years severance if I was let go without cause. She thought she was cutting dead weight, but she just cut the power line. And when the lights start flickering, everyone's going to notice. The walk to my truck felt longer than it ever had. Same pavement, same faded parking lot lines. But everything had shifted. I was no longer Stanley Rowe, operations manager. I was just a man with a cardboard box full of memories and a quiet secret tucked in the back of his mind. The air smelled like metal and oil, comforting, familiar. But even that felt different today, like the scent of something slipping away. I opened the passenger door and placed the box on the seat. Framed photo of Linda, coffee mug with a cracked handle, a stack of maintenance schematics I'd meant to archive. Little pieces of a life spent solving problems other people never noticed. Then I sat in the driver's seat, hands resting on the wheel, not turning the key. Just sitting, watching, remembering. From here I could see the edge of the production floor through the windowed side of the building. Machines I'd helped select, processes I'd optimized, people I'd coached when they were just kids, now supervisors and team leads. They were still in there, moving around like it was just another Tuesday. But it wasn't. They just didn't know it yet. They'd feel it soon. Because Vanessa hadn't read the contract. It wasn't long, maybe 12 pages total, but Charles had made sure every word mattered. He'd added the clause himself, Section 12, Paragraph 3. I remember the meeting when he'd walked it over to HR, personally. In case someone ever forgets what this place is built on, he'd said, sliding the document across the table. I hadn't thought much of it at the time, just another old-school gesture from a man who still believed in loyalty. Turns out, it was a lifeline. I took out my phone and texted Harold Preston, my attorney, friend of the family, spent 3 decades working contracts and employment law. He'd reviewed the agreement back when Charles made the changes, knew it inside out. I typed 2 words. "It's time." He replied almost instantly. "Send me the termination notice." I opened my glove box and pulled out the sealed envelope Vanessa's assistant had handed me with trembling hands. No explanation, no cause. Just a cold, sterile document with my name on it and a signature line from someone who didn't know what she was signing. I took a photo and sent it to Harold. A minute later, the phone rang. "It's airtight," he said. "They're going to regret this." I didn't smile, didn't pump my fist, just nodded, even though he couldn't see it. This wasn't about money. Not really. It was about value, about knowing what you've built, and refusing to let someone rewrite your story just because they sit higher on the org chart. I started the truck and pulled out of the lot. Slowly, deliberately, not with rage, with resolve. She thought she'd ended something. She didn't know it was the beginning. Before there were weekly metrics and performance dashboards, there were machines, real ones. Steel and grease, bolts and belts. And in the middle of it all stood Charles Harper. Not in a suit, not behind glass, but on the floor, sleeves rolled up, his hands dirtier than the men who reported to him. The first time I met him, he was elbow deep in a malfunctioning press, cursing under his breath, refusing to let anyone else fix it until he understood the problem himself. That was Charles. I'd just come off a layoff from an auto plant across town. 41 years old. No fancy resume. No MBA. Just calloused hands and 2 decades of practical experience. I still remember the interview. Charles sat across from me in a folding chair, chewing the end of a pen and squinting at my paperwork like it was a waste of his time. "Credentials don't build machines," he finally said. "Men with sense and skill do." That was the offer. I started the next Monday. Back then, Harper Machinery wasn't a $30 million operation. It was a mid-sized shop trying to punch above its weight. What it had going for it was one thing: reliability. Our equipment didn't look pretty, but it ran. Always. And Charles made sure everyone understood the weight of that promise. Within 2 years, he promoted me to operations manager. Said I was the only one who treated the place like it was mine. I didn't wear a title like armor. Didn't need meetings to feel important. I just made sure nothing broke, on the floor or between departments. He wasn't the kind of man who gave compliments often, but I didn't need them. I saw it in how he trusted me. When vendors tried to push cheap parts, he let me make the call. When the budget tightened, he asked where to cut, and then listened when I said, "Nowhere." He'd grumble, but he'd find another way. I'd never had that before. My own father had walked out when I was 11. 3 boys, 1 tired mother. I learned early how to fix what was broken, even when no one noticed it needed fixing. Charles wasn't warm, but he saw me, and that was enough. Years later, when Linda got sick, he rearranged the production schedule so I could take her to every appointment. Never made me ask, just did it. "Family first, Stanley," he'd mutter, like it was obvious. Like that was the job, too. So when people ask why I stayed for 18 years, why I poured myself into machines that weren't mine and a company I didn't own, I tell them this. Because someone once believed in me when no one else did. And because loyalty isn't a word you write on a mission statement. It's something you prove, one decision at a time. The spreadsheets came later, so did the consultants, the strategists, and eventually Vanessa. But the machines, the people, the culture, that came from Charles, and men like me. The first time Vanessa walked into a production meeting, she looked like she'd gotten lost on her way to a fashion shoot. Leather portfolio clutched tight, blazer too crisp, perfume too loud. I remember the smell more than anything, expensive, like she wanted everyone to know she'd spent more on it than our team leads made in a week. She didn't sit. She stood, like a substitute teacher trying to assert control in a classroom that wasn't hers. She spoke in buzzwords. Synergy, disruption, scalable efficiencies. The kind of language that floats when you've never had to clean hydraulic fluid off your boots. She talked about leaning out processes, not understanding that what she called fat, we called buffer, deliberate slack built into a system that had to work under pressure. There's a reason the machines didn't fail. It wasn't magic. It was engineering. It was people who knew how to read the hum of a motor better than the lines of a spreadsheet. Charles was there at those early meetings, quiet, observing. I saw him wince more than once when Vanessa suggested outsourcing components we'd always built in-house, or when she proposed automating inspection with software she hadn't tested. But he never contradicted her, not once. She needs to learn, he told me one afternoon, leaning in my doorway, arms crossed like a man trying to convince himself. Some lessons can't come from books. I wanted to believe him, that maybe she'd figure it out with time. But the factory floor isn't patient. It doesn't care about your theories. Either your process works, or it doesn't. And if it doesn't, someone loses a finger, or a client. Vanessa never saw that. She never saw the small things, like how we'd staggered lunch breaks by department to keep line flow balanced, or how Jennifer's QC team ran extra cycle tests in the slow season to stress test inventory. She looked at charts, not people. Results, not reasons. Still, I held back. Out of respect for Charles. Out of loyalty. I kept fixing what she broke before it showed up in the numbers. Quietly. Without credit. Because that's what operations does. We keep the engine running, even when the driver doesn't know how to steer. But the tension started creeping in. Good employees began talking in hushed tones. We lost a mid-level supervisor to a rival company, and Vanessa called it natural turnover. I called it a red flag. Then came the reorg. Charles came into my office one afternoon, holding a fresh org chart. His name was gone. Vanessa's was at the top. He didn't look me in the eye. I made her promise, he said, to keep the core team intact. The experience you all bring. That's what makes this place work. I just nodded, because deep down, we both knew the truth. She'd promised to keep the walls standing. But the foundation? She was already tearing that out, one brick at a time. I didn't slam any doors, didn't storm through the office or make some final speech that people would whisper about over lunch. That's not how I wanted to be remembered. That's not who I was. I just walked out with the same quiet precision I'd brought to the job every day for 18 years. One step at a time, box in hand, eyes forward. But I saw them watching. The younger staff tried not to look directly at me, like they were afraid guilt might be contagious. Some had worked under me since they were teenagers, now adults with mortgages, kids, lives. I'd taught them how to read the rhythm of the machines, how to catch a fault before it turned into a shutdown. They owed their stability to the systems we'd built together, but not one of them said a word, not even a goodbye. Not because they didn't care, because they didn't know what to do. Vanessa had made it clear what happens when you stand too close to the past. You get swept out with it. So I gave them nothing to fear, just a small, tired smile and a nod as I passed. My office, my real office, had always been the production floor. That long stretch of concrete humming with potential. Rows of machines, most of them older than the interns now floating around upstairs. I used to walk through there before shift changes, not because I had to, but because it grounded me. The smell of coolant, the clang of metal, the buzz of something being built. You don't get that in boardrooms. Now I looked at it through the windshield of my truck, engine off, hands on the steering wheel. My box of things sat beside me, the weight of it heavier than it should have been. Not because of what was inside, but because of what it represented. Years of reliability. Years of solving problems before they reached anyone else's desk. And just like that, it was over. But Harper wasn't ready for what came next. That much I knew. They could fill my position, post a listing, run interviews. pick a fresh face with credentials and ambition. But what they couldn't replace, what Vanessa didn't even think to ask about, was everything I carried that wasn't written down. The undocumented processes, the workarounds that kept machines alive, the trust of a team who knew I'd never let a system fail on my watch. That's the danger of mistaking silence for weakness, of thinking the person who isn't shouting must not have anything important to say. Vanessa thought she cut a liability. She didn't realize she just opened a fault line, and the cracks were already forming. The next morning, I was at my kitchen table with a mug of black coffee and the silence of a house that had known too much of it lately. Linda used to fill the space, singing off-key while she cooked, fussing about bills I'd already paid. It had been 4 years since the silence became permanent. But today, it wasn't just absence I felt. It was change. Something had shifted. I had the contract out, spread across the table like a map of a battlefield no one thought they'd fight on. Harold had already highlighted the clause in yellow. 2 years severance. No wiggle room. No ambiguity. Just a number. Sitting there like a loaded gun no one expected me to carry. Then the phone rang. Charles Harper. I almost let it go to voicemail. Almost. But 18 years of loyalty doesn't vanish overnight. I answered. Stanley? His voice was gravelly, slower than I remembered. What the hell happened yesterday? I let a beat pass. Ask your daughter. I did, he said, sighing. She said you were resistant, that you weren't embracing the new direction. I said nothing, just let the silence hang there. Charles knew better, knew me, knew I didn't push back unless there was a reason, and when I did, it was to protect the company, not undermine it. You're going to file, aren't you? He asked quietly. I already have, I said. Harold Preston's handling it. He exhaled like a man who'd just realized the fire wasn't contained to one room. I told her to look at the contracts, he muttered. Told her before I stepped down that there were protections in place. For you. For the team. Another pause. She said she cleaned house. You, Thomas, Jennifer, anyone over 50. My jaw tightened. Thomas had built our engineering department from scratch. Jennifer ran the quality control lab like it was sacred ground. Neither of them flashy, both of them essential. Is that the direction you wanted, Charles? I asked, keeping my tone even. Wiping out everyone who made this place work? You know it's not, he said, and this time there was no fight left in his voice, just regret. But I gave her control. It's hers to run now. There were voices in the background on his end, one of them sharp, impatient. Vanessa. Even through the phone, her tone grated. I've got to go, Charles said suddenly. The call cut off. I set the phone down and looked at the contract again. Section 12, paragraph 3. The same clause he insisted on to protect me. Not because he thought it would be needed, but because he knew the world doesn't always reward loyalty. Harold was right. It was airtight. They could pay now or pay more later. But money wasn't the point. They were about to learn what happens when you throw away experience like yesterday's blueprint. And I was just getting started. Harold Preston's office looked exactly like you'd expect from a man who'd been practicing law since before email. Books lined the walls, stacked in uneven piles like bricks holding up the past. His desk was oak, scratched, worn, but solid. The kind of furniture you don't replace, just like the man behind it. He didn't waste time with pleasantries, just pushed a folder toward me with a yellow legal pad tucked inside. Section 12, paragraph 3, he said, tapping it. The clause Charles insisted on. 2 years severance if they terminate you without documented cause. No gray area, no loopholes. It's clean. I leaned back in the chair, watching the steam rise from the cup of burnt office coffee he'd handed me. They didn't even try to fabricate a reason, I said. Just handed me a letter and walked me out. Harold chuckled under his breath, the way men do when they're both amused and mildly disgusted. She's green, arrogant, probably thought you'd just disappear. She probably thinks I already have. He looked at me, head tilted slightly. You don't sound angry. I'm not, I said, and I meant it. I'm not trying to burn the place down, Harold. I just want them to understand what they threw away. He nodded slowly. This isn't about money then. No, I said. It's about value, respect. 18 years of making that place run, and I got dismissed like a defective part. I want the record to show that someone still remembers how it worked, and who kept it running. He leaned forward, folded his hands. Then we do it the right way. We don't bluff. We don't posture. We just point at the contract and wait for them to blink. Good, I said. Because I'm not here to fight dirty. I just want what was promised. And what they owe, Harold added. They owe you more than a check, but the check is a good place to start. I stood up, ran my hand over the back of the chair, the leather cracked from years of use. Everything about Harold's office felt like it belonged to a different time. A better one, maybe. When people didn't need contracts to enforce decency. But this wasn't that world anymore. I walked to the window. Cars passed by outside. Fast. Impersonal. Just like the new version of Harper machinery. Efficiency over substance. Optics over outcomes. It was all show now, no steel underneath. They don't think I'll push back, I said. That's their mistake, Harold replied. You don't push. You anchor. I turned back toward him. The folder was still open on the desk, the clause underlined in yellow. Quiet. Unshakable. They'll offer a fraction, he said. It's what they always do. Then we'll decline, I said, with the same silence they gave me when they let me go. Because this was never about revenge. It was about reminding them what happens when you forget who built the machine. The garage still smelled like oil and cedar, even though I hadn't worked on anything in weeks. It was my ritual, tinkering after dinner, rebuilding old engines the way some men garden or play golf. I wasn't trying to restore cars for show. I just liked understanding how things worked. Liked knowing that with the right parts, the right hands, anything could run again. That's how I saw life. Machines don't lie. They don't play politics. They either work or they don't. If something breaks, it's because something wasn't respected. A misalignment, a lack of maintenance. You find it, you fix it. It was never about money. Not for me. The truth is, I didn't grow up around anything you'd call stable. My dad walked out when I was 11, left my mom with 3 boys and a secretary's salary. We didn't have much, but we had each other. And when something broke, you didn't replace it. You fixed it. That mindset stuck. I didn't chase status. I chased structure, reliability. I met Linda when I was 24. She was calm, warm, the kind of person who made rooms quieter just by walking into them. We were married for 29 years before cancer took her. She fought with grace. I stayed by her side the way I ran Harper machinery, quietly, consistently, without expecting a thank you, just because it mattered. We had 2 kids. David lives in Denver, works for an engineering firm. Smart, sharp, reminds me of Linda. Lisa's in Cleveland, teaches 3rd grade. She calls every Sunday, always starts with "Hi, Dad," like she's still 10 years old. They're grown now, building lives of their own. But they call because they know I answer. I always answer. When I joined Harper, it wasn't supposed to be forever. I'd just been laid off, didn't have a plan, only a resume full of grit and hands-on experience. Charles took a chance on me when I didn't even fully believe in myself. Promoted me within 2 years, gave me a place to dig in and build something real. And I did. Not just machines, not just systems, legacy. That floor ran because I made sure it did. That company survived downturns, supply chain issues, and 3 recessions because I made contingency plans before anyone asked. I wasn't in the spotlight, and I never wanted to be. I was the foundation. The quiet certainty beneath it all. Vanessa never saw that. She thought job titles mattered more than trust. That leadership came from a degree, not decades. But buildings aren't held up by the paint. They're held up by the beams behind the walls. I didn't stay at Harper to collect a check. I stayed because when someone gives you a shot, you honor that by making everything around you stronger. So no, it was never just a job. It was a promise. And I don't break those. The thing about being in operations for nearly 2 decades is, you know who's essential. Not the ones who speak loudest in meetings, the ones who get things done when no one's watching, the ones who don't need credit because they know the machines will tell the truth. And when Vanessa fired me, she didn't just cut one thread, she yanked at the whole web. The morning after the call with Charles, I sat in my den with a yellow notepad and a ballpoint pen. Old school, like everything else I trusted. I started writing names. Thomas Baldwin, Jennifer Ortiz, Calvin Reeves, Susan Tran. One by one, the names of people who had built Harper Machinery from the inside out. I didn't need to check their numbers. I'd memorized their service years like they were my own. They were all gone, swept out in one motion. No performance issues, no cause. Just realignment. I started with Thomas. We'd worked side by side for 12 years. He knew the engineering systems like they were written in his DNA. If a machine was misbehaving, Thomas could diagnose it before it even stopped running. I called him just after lunch. "Stanley?" His voice cracked like he hadn't spoken all day. "Did you hear?" "I did," I said, "and I already know they didn't read your contract." He paused. "There's a clause, right?" "Same as mine. Section 12, paragraph 3. Harold Preston?" "Already handling it," I said. "Give him a call. He'll walk you through everything." Thomas let out a low breath. "They tried to get me to sign a release on the spot. I told them I'd get back to them." Smart. I hung up and called Jennifer next. She answered on the second ring, voice sharp as ever. "Stanley, I was hoping I'd hear from you." "You get the boot too?" "2 days before you," she said. No explanation, just a memo and a security escort, like I was some kind of threat. I didn't laugh. It wasn't funny. Jennifer ran quality control like a fortress. Nothing left the building without her team's approval. She'd caught design flaws, flagged material inconsistencies, and once saved a $1.2 million contract by catching a hairline fracture in a prototype cylinder the vendor missed, and they treated her like a liability. "They're counting on silence," I said, "but we're not giving them that." By nightfall, I'd made 7 calls, each conversation different, but the tone the same. Shock, anger, disbelief. And then a shift. When I told them about Harold, about the clause, about what we could do, they thought they'd been discarded, forgotten. I reminded them of their value. One call became many. And every time I hung up, the same realization sank deeper. This wasn't just a firing spree. This was a purge, a deliberate sweep of anyone who remembered how the place was built. But Harper Machinery was about to learn. Some legacies don't go quietly. Douglas Clean had been trying to poach me for years. Every time we ran into each other at trade shows or supplier meetings, he'd make the same pitch. "Stanley, if you ever get tired of patching holes in a sinking ship, you call me. We'll build something that floats." I always smiled, shook his hand, told him I appreciated the offer, but I wasn't going anywhere. Loyalty meant something back then. But now? Now the ship had tossed me overboard. I stared at my phone for a full minute before making the call. It wasn't hesitation, it was transition. The kind of moment you can't rush because once it starts, there's no going back. He picked up on the second ring. Well, he said. "I was wondering when I'd get this call. Still interested in that conversation?" He laughed, deep and genuine. "Stanley Rowe, I'd clear my schedule for you if you wanted to sell gumballs." "I'm not here to sell anything," I said. "But I've got an idea." He got quiet. That was always a good sign with Douglas. He wasn't a talker. He was a builder. Old school like me. Owned precision parts for over 30 years. Carved out a niche by doing what big manufacturers wouldn't. Small batch, high margin, custom hydraulic components. It wasn't flashy work, but it was profitable. and personal, and precise. I laid it out for him. Not a job offer, a partnership, a new division, built from the ground up, led by the people Harper had just cast aside. People who understood legacy, not just logistics. People who'd kept that place running while the executives played with strategy decks and new logos. You bring the investment, I told him. I bring the talent. He didn't answer right away. I could hear him scribbling something on paper, probably doing napkin math in that cluttered office of his. You serious? He finally said. Serious enough to walk away from everything with nothing but a box and a contract clause. He whistled. Damn. What do you need from me? Space, equipment, some capital to get us started. I've already got people lined up. Engineers, programmers, quality control, all vetted, all fired last week. You're building your own Harper. No, I said. I'm building what Harper was supposed to be. Silence again. Then, come by tomorrow, 9 o'clock. We'll put something on paper. I hung up and sat back in my chair, staring at the ceiling. For the first time in weeks, I didn't feel hollow. I felt awake. Vanessa thought she erased me. What she didn't know was that she'd just lit the match under something better. And I wasn't alone. 3 days after she fired me, I found myself back in a downtown conference room with Harold Preston at my side. The table was polished to a ridiculous shine, like they thought professionalism could be faked with furniture. Vanessa sat across from us, legs crossed, arms folded, her expression set to smug detachment. Beside her was a young corporate attorney named Justin, probably hadn't seen 30 yet, who looked like he'd studied employment law from a PowerPoint slide. This is ridiculous, Vanessa said without looking at me. We're implementing a new direction. That's cause enough. Harold didn't flinch, didn't even blink. He calmly opened his briefcase, slid out a copy of my contract, and turned it toward Justin. Yellow highlights marked it like a crime scene. Termination without cause, as defined in Appendix C, Harold read aloud. Requires severance equal to 24 months of salary. In Mr. Rowe's case, that's approximately $320,000. Justin squirmed slightly. His eyes darted to the clause, then to Vanessa, then back to the clause. He was resistant to change, Vanessa cut in. That's insubordination. Harold was already ahead of her. Where's the documentation? He asked, voice calm, surgical. Written warnings? Performance improvement plans? Anything showing a pattern of behavior as outlined in the contract? Justin shuffled through a thin folder. Too thin. He didn't find what he needed. Vanessa's jaw tightened. We'll offer 6 months, she said. Take it or leave it. Harold closed the contract. We'll leave it and proceed with legal action, which, by the way, includes discovery into the terminations of multiple employees over the age of 50 in the same week. That landed. Justin's face paled. He leaned in toward Vanessa, whispering something urgent. She brushed him off. Before she could say another word, the door opened. Charles Harper stepped in. I hadn't seen him since the retirement party. He looked thinner, paler, but his eyes, those were still sharp. Vanessa, he said, voice low but steady. A word. She froze. Dad, we're in the middle of... Not a request. They stepped outside, glass walls making the argument visible even if we couldn't hear it. Charles gestured emphatically. Vanessa's posture changed, defensive, then cornered. When they returned, she didn't look at me, not once. Justin, Charles said, prepare the severance agreement as written in the contract. Dad, Vanessa started. Not now. Charles turned to me. I apologize, Stanley. This isn't how I wanted things to end. I nodded. That was enough. As Harold and I gathered our things, Vanessa stepped in front of me, voice low and sharp. This isn't over. I'll be reviewing all vendor relationships. Any company that hires you can forget about doing business with Harper. Charles said nothing, but I was already thinking about Douglas, about the partnership we'd inked that morning, about the niche Harper had ignored for years, and we were about to dominate. You're right about one thing, I said, walking past her. It isn't over. It had only just begun. The diner was nearly empty when I got there. Just a couple of truckers at the counter and the usual old man in the back booth nursing a refill he hadn't paid for in an hour. Thomas showed up 5 minutes later, coat unzipped, dark circles under his eyes. He looked like a man who'd been trying to convince himself this was just a rough patch. We didn't start with small talk. We didn't need to. They offered me a year's severance, he said, sliding into the booth across from me. Not bad. Better than I expected. And the NDA? I asked. He snorted. 5 years. Can't talk about any of my work. Can't consult. Can't even teach a class on hydraulic systems without clearance. I shook my head. That's not protection. That's a muzzle. He stirred his coffee but didn't drink it. I've got a granddaughter starting college next fall. Can't afford to get blacklisted. I reached into my jacket and slid a card across the table. Douglas Clean. Precision Parts. He's looking for a consultant who knows precision hydraulics. NDA free. Thomas looked down at the card, then up at me, confused. You're stirring the pot, Stanley. Maybe, but not without a plan. He leaned forward. What's going on? I'm partnering with Douglas, I said. We're launching a new division, custom hydraulic components, the high-margin stuff Harper stopped caring about. The kind of work you and I always said was the company's future, until Vanessa started chasing mass production like we were going to compete with China on volume. He blinked, processing. The custom line? Charles always believed that was the key. Exactly. And she's already sold off half the equipment Charles bought for it. Jennifer told me last week, auctioned it for pennies. Thomas ran a hand through his thinning hair. That's millions in machinery. Gone. Jesus. We sat there a moment, letting the weight of it settle. She's stripping it down, I said. Turning Harper into a spreadsheet operation with no soul. And people like us? We're just cost centers to her. And Charles? Still trying to believe she's just making rookie mistakes. He doesn't see the long game yet. Thomas stared at the card again, his thumb tapping the edge. You think she's cashing out? I think she already started. He looked up. Why are you telling me this? Why now? Because we can do something better, I said. Something built on respect, on knowing the difference between cost and value. Douglas is the investor. I'll run operations, but I need an engineer, one who understands the old systems and can design the new. He stared at me for a long moment. Then finally he smiled. Just a little. You sure this isn't personal? It is, I said. But it's also right. Thomas pocketed the card. The coffee between us had gone cold. The work ahead wouldn't be easy. But this time, it would be ours. No muzzles, no memos, just purpose. The warehouse wasn't much to look at. Concrete floors, high ceilings, a few cracked windows still waiting to be replaced. But to me, it felt like home. Clean slate. No politics. No legacy to protect. Only one to build. We called it Cornerstone Precision. Thomas came up with the name. You don't start with the roof, he'd said. You start with the part that holds everything else. Douglas signed the lease with one stroke of his pen. Then he rolled up his sleeves and started making calls. Suppliers, vendors, equipment brokers. I handled the rest. Layouts, staffing, schedules. It felt like rewiring muscle memory. But instead of patching a sinking ship, I was designing one to sail. By the end of the first week, we had 4 former Harper employees on the roster. By the second, we had 7, all top performers, all discarded for being part of the old culture. Jason Wright, the CNC programmer Vanessa had pushed out, joined without hesitation, said he'd never felt more insulted than when his department got a 30% budget cut, while Vanessa doubled her salary. Susan Tran came next. Procurement wizard. Could source parts under pressure and squeeze better terms from vendors than most full-time negotiators. Then came Calvin, systems lead. Jennifer was still at Harper, stuck under a contract until retirement, but she was watching and feeding me updates. The machines arrived piece by piece. Some bought second-hand, some reclaimed from Harper's last auction, ironically. We cleaned them, restored them, recalibrated every gear. By the end of the month, we had a floor. Not big, not flashy, but real. Running. And word started to spread. Clients who used to call Harper started calling us. Vendors followed the money, the leadership, and the respect. They knew who the real operators were. Not the ones holding titles, but the ones who held things together. Then came the whispers from inside Harper. Production delays, QA issues, clients threatening to pull contracts. Jennifer sent a picture of a handwritten memo tacked to the break room wall. All concerns must be directed to management. Do not discuss performance issues with clients. That wasn't damage control. That was fear. I showed it to Douglas. He just nodded. They're feeling the fracture, he said, losing the spine. They're still standing, I said. For now. But the cracks were deepening. We weren't just building a company. We were building a refuge for craftsmen, engineers, operators who'd been tossed aside because they didn't fit a marketing vision. Here they mattered. They knew it. And they worked like it. Every bolt they tightened, every schematic they reviewed, it wasn't just for a paycheck. It was to prove something. Harper threw away its foundation. We were building something with roots. The first photo Jennifer sent was of a production board. Dry erase grids smeared with half-erased numbers, delivery dates crossed out, and a handwritten note in red marker that simply read, "Pushed again." She didn't even need to caption it. I knew what it meant. Missed deadlines. No one taking accountability. And worse, no one left who understood how to fix it. A week later, she sent another. It was a screenshot of an internal memo marked, "Confidential, do not distribute." Vanessa's name at the bottom. The language was pure spin. We are experiencing temporary throughput challenges due to workforce transitions and evolving client expectations. But I knew what that translated to. They were bleeding talent, and the results were finally showing. By the third message, Jennifer's tone had changed. No more sarcasm, just quiet concern. 3 major clients have threatened to pull. One's already gone. That one client, Midwest Manufacturing, had been with Harper since Charles first landed his biggest contract. We built their hydraulic lifters from scratch, tested them in-house, stood by every unit until it passed our standards. They were loyal. Until Harper stopped being dependable. I showed Douglas the messages. He leaned back in his chair, laced his fingers behind his head, and let out a low whistle. "You seeing this?" I asked. "More clearly than ever," he said. "They gutted the company to look nimble. Turns out bones don't bend." It wasn't just the machines that were failing. It was the people, the glue. The ones who stayed were either new hires with no guidance or veterans trying to survive with no support. Managers were being promoted based on enthusiasm, not expertise. QA errors were slipping through. Maintenance was reactive, not preventive. Everything we'd built over decades eroded in months. Jennifer sent one last message that week. Just a single sentence. Vanessa authorized an overseas supplier to replace in-house components. That hit like a gut punch. Those parts weren't interchangeable. We'd designed them for custom fits, specific tolerances. You couldn't just plug in a cheaper version and hope. That wasn't engineering. That was gambling. And Harper had just gone all in. Clients started calling me. Quietly at first, feeling things out, asking questions they already knew the answers to. "Are you up and running? Can you meet our specs? Can we talk, off the record?" Douglas scheduled meetings. I reviewed schematics. And one by one, the contracts that Harper used to hold like trophies started circling our doorstep. We didn't gloat. We didn't celebrate. Because this wasn't about revenge. This was about rescue. They weren't just losing business. They were losing belief. The call came late in the afternoon, just as I was reviewing staffing schedules for the next production phase. I almost let it go to voicemail, but something in my gut made me swipe to answer. Charles Harper. His name still carried weight with me, even now. "Stanley," he said, voice strained, quieter than I remembered. "We need to talk." I didn't respond right away, just waited. "I know what you're doing," he continued. The new company. The Harper people you've hired. The clients starting to shift their calls. Again, I said nothing, because none of that was a secret, and none of it was wrong. I'm not calling to ask you to stop, he said, and I could hear the exhaustion bleeding through every word. I'm calling to ask for your help. That got my attention. What kind of help? There was a pause, the kind that carries the weight of things a man doesn't want to say out loud. Vanessa's been selling off assets, outsourcing everything she doesn't understand, cutting corners on quality. The board's worried, so am I. She's not modernizing, I said. She's gutting it. I see that now, he admitted. Too late, maybe, but I see it. He cleared his throat. You were right, Stanley. She wasn't ready. I should have said something when I had the chance, should have backed you when you warned me. I looked around the office. Blueprints on the wall, specs on the desk, orders coming in faster than we expected. I wasn't in limbo anymore. I had a future, one I was shaping every day. What exactly are you asking, Charles? Come to my house tonight, he said. 7 o'clock. Bring Thomas if he's willing. The board wants to meet, to discuss options. Options, I repeated. Like what? Another pause, then carefully. Including a change in leadership. For a moment, I didn't say a word. I thought about every decision that had brought me to this point. The cardboard box, the severance negotiation, the silence of the Harper floor when I walked out, the calls, the rebuilding, the fire that Vanessa lit by mistake, and how it turned into something stronger than she ever intended to destroy. I'll be there, I said finally, but I'm not promising anything. Fair enough, Charles replied, relief slipping into his voice. And Stanley? Yeah? Thank you for still taking my calls. When the line went dead, I sat there, staring at the window. Outside, workers were unloading a shipment, machines humming, orders printing, a company coming to life. He was right to call me. But this time, I wasn't walking back into Harper with a badge and a smile. I was walking in with leverage, and this time, I'd write the terms. Vanessa stood at the head of the table, clicking through a slide deck filled with excuses dressed as data. Phrases like market volatility and inevitable post-transition dip floated in the air, trying to patch over a 37% drop in revenue. Most of the executive team flanking her looked barely old enough to rent a car, and all of them looked like they'd rather be anywhere else. She didn't see me at first. I stood at the back of the room with Charles and the board. That had been the agreement. Let her speak first. Let her bury herself in charts and jargon. Let the people in charge see what leadership by PowerPoint really looked like. When she finally caught sight of me, she froze. The next slide hung in limbo behind her, half faded and irrelevant. What is he doing here? She snapped, pointing in my direction. Charles didn't even look at her. He nodded to the chairman, who stood slowly. Vanessa, he said calmly, the board has reached a decision regarding the company's leadership. Her face drained of color. You can't be serious. The chairman turned to me. Stanley, would you like to explain the new arrangement? I stepped forward, holding the same folder Harold had once prepared for my severance. But this time, it wasn't a defense. It was a declaration. Harper Machinery is merging with Cornerstone Precision, I said. The board has approved the acquisition agreement as of this morning. Vanessa laughed, a brittle, desperate sound. This is absurd. I'm the majority shareholder. No, Charles said quietly. He stood now, slower than he once did, but with more weight behind the words. You hold 20%. I retained 51%. Vanessa turned to him, stunned. You said... I said I was retiring, he cut in. I never said I was stepping away completely. I slid the folder across the table toward her. Cornerstone will absorb the custom hydraulics division. The rest of Harper will continue under new leadership. Thomas stepped into the room like he'd been waiting for the cue. Calm, focused. That leadership, I continued, will be mine. She flipped through the pages, her hands trembling. This wasn't a pitch. This wasn't a request. It was done. This is... She started, but I cut her off. "This is business," I said. "Nothing personal." And I meant it. Because this wasn't about payback. It was about survival. About building something that could last. About leading with experience instead of ego. The room went quiet. For a moment, no one moved. Then the chairman stood. "Effective immediately, Harper Machinery will operate under the Harper Cornerstone Partnership, with Stanley Rowe as CEO and Thomas Baldwin as Chief Engineering Officer." Vanessa backed away from the table, eyes burning, lips tight. She said nothing. No protest, no final insult, just the sound of her heels as she walked out. It wasn't a victory lap, it was a reset. The machine was back in working hands. Vanessa didn't say a word on her way out. No threat, no parting shot, no sudden realization of what she'd done, just silence. And maybe that was the loudest thing she'd ever said, because for the first time she understood she was out of her depth, and out of moves. The merger paperwork had been signed that morning, clean, binding. Charles had waited until the board was in the room before finalizing it. He didn't want another backroom debate. He wanted it done. And when he handed me the signed documents, he didn't say much, just a nod, the kind only two men who'd built something together could understand. We didn't celebrate. We got to work. Cornerstone Precision officially absorbed Harper Machinery's custom hydraulics division. The rest of Harper would continue as a leaner operation, but the soul of the company, the work that required care, craftsmanship, and decades of know-how, was now under our roof, under our name. First order of business: bring back the people who never should have been pushed out. Thomas was announced as Chief Engineering Officer. It wasn't even a question. His designs were already being integrated into our next line of components. He walked back into that building with blueprints under his arm and a grin that hadn't been seen in months. Jason returned to head up our CNC operations. Calvin was building out the systems architecture from scratch, no legacy junk to weigh him down. Susan came back to lead procurement, and within a week, she'd negotiated supplier contracts that would have taken Harper a quarter to sort through. Jennifer couldn't leave just yet. Her contract still locked her in until retirement, but she started holding her team lunches across the street, always with a folder tucked discreetly under her arm. They came back not because they were desperate, but because they believed. In the mission, in the leadership, in something they could actually be proud of again. We didn't try to rebuild Harper. We built something better. The floor was different now, more efficient, more agile. But the principles hadn't changed. Every part mattered. Every voice counted. You didn't get promoted because you were loud. You moved up because people trusted you when the system broke and everyone else froze. I walked through the new facility one morning just after sunrise, coffee in hand, watching the team gear up for the first joint production run under the Harper Cornerstone name. There was no big speech, no ribbon cutting, just heads down, hands moving, machines warming up. That's what leadership should look like, not press releases, not buzzwords. Work. Before I stepped back into my office, I passed Thomas reviewing a schematic with a younger engineer. He looked up and smiled. "Feels right now," he said. It did. We didn't burn bridges. We built new ones. And we made sure they could hold weight. 1 year later, I stood on the mezzanine overlooking the floor of the newly expanded Harper Cornerstone facility. It was a different world from the day I carried that cardboard box out of Vanessa's office. The machines below moved with rhythm, precision, our rhythm. There was a calm efficiency to it, like a team that knew exactly what it was doing and why it mattered. Every station, every process, had a fingerprint. Not from a manual, but from people who built it with care. Charles stood beside me, leaning heavily on his cane. He'd lost weight, and the lines on his face ran deeper now. But his eyes had that old steel again. The kind that doesn't bend with time, only sharpens. "Quarterly numbers just came in," he said, handing me a slim report. I flipped through it. Best in 5 years. Profit margins were up. Employee retention stabilized. We'd filed 3 new patents, with 2 more in development. Not bad for a company that had been circling the drain just a year ago. He watched the floor for a moment, then turned to me. Vanessa called yesterday. I didn't react. I just waited. She's starting a consulting firm, he continued. Wants investors. Will you? Charles shook his head. Told her to come back to Indianapolis first. Learn the business from the ground up, like I did. Like you did. And? She hung up, he said, then added with a faint smile. But she called back this morning, asked if the offer still stood. I didn't say anything, just stared out over the floor, where Jennifer was doing a final inspection on a shipment bound for the East Coast. Jason was training 2 new hires on the latest CNC calibration software. Thomas stood at his workstation, sketching something by hand before transferring it to CAD. Innovation and experience, side by side. No tension, just purpose. That clause in your contract, Charles said suddenly. When I added it, I thought I was protecting an employee. You were, I said. You just didn't know you were protecting your company too. We stood there in silence, the hum of machines below like a heartbeat. We hadn't saved Harper. We'd transformed it. We didn't do it with slogans or shiny decks. We did it with steel, sweat, memory, and the quiet kind of leadership that doesn't beg to be seen. A text came through as we stood there. It was from Vanessa, ready to come home, willing to start over. Where do I begin? I looked at Charles. He didn't say a word. I typed back one line. You start at the bottom, just like the rest of us, because legacies aren't inherited. They're earned. And the ones that last? They're built one bolt at a time.